everybody. Welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It's Dan, and I hate to say it, but I got another damn lawyer on. No, I'm kidding. I love lawyers. You know that. The reason I bring them on, though, is every one of them that's come on, and my guests today are awesome. They're on various social medias, and what I love about all of them is they're sharing information. They're trying to help you out. And that's why I bring them on, is because they're able to give you information to educate you and really bring a better understanding, because unfortunately divorce is a reality for many people, and if we can help people have a better understanding of it, what it's like, whether you decide to get divorced or not, it can help you out. So my guest today is Frank, and let me just bring him on so he can say hi. Frank, how are you?
Hey
And
Dan, how's it going?
I followed him on TikTok. I don't know, probably I think it was about 5-6 weeks ago, Frank, and love your content. I'm not saying that because you're sitting in front of me and we're chit chatting. Okay, just for the record, I'll put my hand on the Bible and swear to it if you'd like. What I love about it is you do educate people, and you're coming at it from a common sense perspective, is the way I would put it. Like, here's the realities you're going to have to deal with and accept. You may not like what I have to say, but you need to know it. I think that's kind of the way I would put it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that is 100% my goal with TikTok, and been doing it for, gosh, I guess about 2 years now. And it is an outlet for me, but it is something where, you know, an hour or so a day, I get to kind of be real and tell people, exactly what I think about, kind of what they should do in their cases and help them through.
Mm-hmm.
And without kind of the other side of like, hey, this is my client, I've got to kind of suck up to you today and tell you what you want to hear. It's none of that on TikTok. It really is just, look, this is really what you should do. You really want to have a better outcome in your case. This is how it happens. You could get too caught up in the rest of the details, but and you could argue with me about whether it's right or not, but this is really the way that you can make some change for yourself
To use
or
a phrase that I use on my fitness side, you're telling people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And that is a very important thing. So, if you would, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, Frank? Introduce yourself and whatever you want to share with the audience.
Yeah, I'm from North Carolina. Was born and raised in North Carolina, and since 2015, been practicing law in the state of North Carolina, and mostly in the western part. So I'm in a lot of smaller towns. For those not as familiar with North Carolina, I'm pretty much everywhere west of Charlotte, which is a lot of mountains, a lot of smaller towns, a lot of communities, and the bulk of my practice in that time has been in family law. There's been, a few things. I do a little criminal law and some other things too, but that's the main thing that our firm does, King Law, and we're across the whole western part. I'm a partner there now since 2020, and really still enjoy what I'm doing most days, helping people through probably the most difficult time that they're going through when they're dealing with a divorce or custody situation.
I always share with people that I worked for a law firm for about 18 months, give or take, back in the mid 2000s, 2006, 7. And I always laugh about it because you ever watch the show LA Law? You might be a little young for it, but I lived LA Law, for those of you old enough to know what that show was. If you have not checked it out, Frank, go watch it. And I can tell you everything in there was true as I lived through it. But it was interesting. And I also put on 30 pounds because there's food everywhere in law firms. Just side note that nobody cares about, but I thought I'd share it. So anyway, the reason I wanted to have Frank on, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the big things is a video you did not too long ago where you were talking about specifically parental alienation. You did a couple things on it, and it really intrigued me because it's something I hear about from my listeners a lot. I've had people request me to talk more about it. I actually did a series on it not too long ago, short one, and it's something that I lived through as a child. So my mother attempted to alienate me from my father. I've talked about that before, to some success, not complete success. And I lived through it as a parent. Also, my ex-wife, first ex-wife, let me say that right, alienated me from a couple of my kids, one of whom I have not spoken to since 2001. So I kind of understand it from that perspective. But I thought it would be interesting, especially after seeing your video, to kind of have you on and talk a little bit about it in general. We can talk about some other things too, but
Yeah.
in a nutshell, how would you define what parental alienation is? Because one of the common things that I find is most people don't really understand what it is.
Yeah, I will tell you this, parental alienation is a topic that um, prior to COVID, I really didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about. And I know that I don't mean to diminish, how often it was happening before that, but for me in my practice, I just rarely saw it, or at least I didn't notice it when I saw it. But coming out of COVID, when courts started opening back up and we started to have more trials, I started seeing this in almost every one of my cases, or at least to some degree.
Really, that
And
much?
it it was happening. I will tell you, I had probably a 6 month stretch where half of my cases I was dealing with some level of one parent, alienate. I guess depending on there's a lot of ways to look at
Yeah.
alienation, and that's really one of the things that I think it holds a lot of people up because if you do a Google search on parental alienation, you will have kind of half these articles saying, look, it's not recognized, this is not a real thing, it's a made up part. What you won't find is any of that research or studies that says that one parent can't manipulate a child against another parent. Virtually every professional is going to agree that that's possible, that it happens every day. What you call it, I think, there's some level of change in that, but at least some form of manipulation of one parent against a child, one parent to a child against another parent was happening all the time in my cases. I think it's slowed down some. And maybe those were just the ones that happened to be, the most pressing, when we were getting, kind of coming out of COVID and what that looked like. But it was happening a lot for me. And it's one thing that really wanted to take some time and look at in more detail. And then TikTok has obviously played a big role in that. And now I feel like I'm getting asked to speak on it. And, I've got enough writings to eventually maybe get to a book on it, but we'll see how that ends up playing out.
I would
But
love to
spend a
read
lot of
that
time.
book, my friend. When you bring it out, I will be one of the first to buy it because it's something that I've studied as well. Not that I'm planning on writing a book on it, although I'm writing a book on other things. But I guess a question I want to ask you. So you say you're seeing it. It popped up more after the pandemic. Do you think that that's attributable maybe to the pandemic a little bit because we were all confined to our homes, for lack of a better term, for a long time? It allowed let's go with creative juices to flow, if I can put it that way. I'm trying to be polite here, but do you think that
Yeah.
might have had an effect on it?
No, I think it absolutely did. I haven't heard any sort of, professional scientific research on that topic, but I think it did. You just had so much, kids were spending way more time with their parents. They weren't going to school, parents were working at home. It was just, you were stuck in that room with a parent for a lot of time. And there was just more opportunity to have that influence. And, whether it was more kind of, let's call it the evil version, whether there was intent to alienate or not, there was just so much more opportunity to exert influence over kids. And I think that's what led to a lot more of that happening during the pandemic.
And you're seeing that with mental illness also. A lot of more people because they were isolated or they were isolated with families. Those type of things popped up. You mentioned an interesting point, which is that those that say it doesn't exist or they'll point to the DSM-5 doesn't have it.
Right.
But you made the excellent point on that, which is that's true. That's a fact. But those professionals, mental health professionals, will also acknowledge that these things happen. It's not codified that way. And who knows when the six comes out, as I call it, who knows, they may change it. I hate those things for the past. I remember going back to 3 and 4, just so you know. But the question I want to go next is knowing that the mental health community hasn't put it into their book. Does the legal profession, and every state's different, I know, but do the courts recognize it as I don't know how I want to phrase it, a valid concern, a legal concern? Is there a legal definition for it?
Well, yes and no is the best answer there. I think if you said parental alienation in any courtroom, probably across the country, the judge is not going to look at you like you're dumb, or, there's going to be some acknowledgement of what you mean by that.
Hmm.
But I think our courts are very, very ill prepared in dealing with those issues, at least in my experience. And there are jurisdictions that have done a better job of defining that out. North Carolina, we really haven't. There's a couple cases that mention it. I did a search actually, kind of in preparation for our talk today. I did a search through our bench book, and I think I found maybe two times where parental alienation was mentioned in our family law bench book for North Carolina. So it's in there. There is some level of acknowledgement that this is a thing, but defining it, no. And I think our courts do a pretty terrible job of really handling it the way that they need to, especially in our smaller, areas. The closer you get to Charlotte, the closer you get to Raleigh, you're probably going to see a lot more of that kind of more professional approach to it. But there are negatives that come with that too, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've talked with family court judges up in New York, where I'm originally from, about
Yeah.
this, including a couple who were no longer doing it. They were exes. So they were willing to share a bit more than the ones who are actually on the bench now. But it was interesting to hear them say that they acknowledge that it exists. They know that they saw it. One of them, though, was very honest with me. He goes, "I don't know how to deal with it. I'm not trained in that. He never had in all his years of training, both as a lawyer, as a judge, and just in general. He said, I never had any experienced training of it other than what I saw for myself." Do you think that happens here in North Carolina and nationwide? My opinion is yes, but I would be curious to hear yours.
Yeah. No question. I will give you. So the way that lawyers see this a lot of the time is, every client, every person who's going through a situation like this assumes it's alienation, and they're going to tell you it's alienation. Not every case is, obviously. But where we see it is child testimony. And I have gotten to the point of where I do a decent job of picking up on that. But you could go through a list, like here are the warning signs of alienation. You could have a child testify without parents around and literally go down that list one after another. And I've seen judges be like, I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's alienation. It's there. I don't know why he doesn't really want to see dad or, see mom, whoever it is. But, when I'm working down that line, judges just don't accept it, even when they see it sometimes. That is because of that lack of training. There just is nothing out there for them, for the most part, to get that information from without kind of doing it independently.
One of the things that people get on me for is I tend to defend the judges a bit, because, and I've said this many times before, it's not a job I would ever want to do. They basically have an hour or two to decide a kid's potential next 18, 25 years, depending on the state you're in. And it's an impossible situation, I feel. But that said, they do struggle to recognize it. I think I know that my personal situation with my first wife, where it was not recognized for a long time. He knew something was going on. It was kind of like the way you said, I kind of feel something here, but I can't put my finger on it, type thing. And it took him a while, but then it clicked, and I actually ended up with custody, and that was a direct result of all of that. But it's interesting to hear, different perspectives on how the legal system is kind of behind the times, if you will, on this. And there's different levels of it. One of the things that I struggle with is people will take the most minor of things and view it as major parental alienation. That's not the case. Not letting you see the kid for a weekend and, bad mouthing dad for that weekend or mom. Yeah, it is alienation technically, but I'm not calling it that. It's persistent over time.
Right.
That's how I define it. How would you define it?
Well, I usually focus more on what the child is actually experiencing and what they are exhibiting, because to me it's way more, one parent acting a certain way. Yeah, like you said, that's alienation, but that's not something that you have to, like, up here, in their mind, that's not something that you have to undo, really. I mean, over time it can be, and it leads to the same place. But however you want to define this, parental alienation syndrome, whatever, when that kind of, when it's outwardly comes, what comes out of the child when this is happening, that's where typically I'm going to look more at, and push harder with the court to do more drastic measures in those situations. Because when a kid is saying, hey, I don't want to see this parent, and they can't tell you why, or they can't tell you one single good thing about that parent, or I'm trying to think of a few other examples, but they're, this, like, they can't, nothing is wrong with the parent that they want to be with, and everything is wrong with the other parent, and there's no real rational reason to describe that.
Mm-hmm.
When I start seeing those situations, that's when it really hammers it home to me, more than it is, hey, we're arguing over this weekend, I was supposed to have them, she's not letting me have them. Those are serious things that need to be worked out, but I don't really worry about them as much in the alienation context as I do. It sounds bad, but that's a custody case. That's every
Exactly.
custody
That's
case.
my point with it all too, right? That's a one-off type, or hopefully a one-off, but that's to me is not true alienation. That's a it's a terrible situation. I'm trying to make light of it, but it's not
Agreed.
true
Agreed.
alienation. I think that, trying to add some perspective to that, because again, I hear from my listeners all the time and they're like, well, I'm being alienated. I'm like, no, you're not really. Not, I like the kind of the way you put it is it affecting the child's thought process on how they view the other parent? Do you mind share? I know you can't share specifics on specific cases you're working on, but do you mind sharing like a couple of examples of where you started suspecting it and how it kind of triggered you to think it might be going on? Because I think that's an important thing to people to hear.
Yeah. Obviously the first moment is whether you hear it from a client, from the parent themselves, or whether you hear it in court and testimony, but just, the kid does not want to go at all. They don't want to see the other parent at all. That kind of starts me thinking about it. And then it's kind of figuring out from there. Knowing things that they shouldn't know, that is a very frequent part that you'll hear from the courts all the time too. That's the one that is probably the easiest kind of smoking gun to show.
Can you give an
Um,
example, Frank, of what that might be, for example?
let's say we file a motion to modify a custody order, and a kid is testifying and they say things like, my dad's not going to let me see my mom anymore because he says XXX. And, it's just like line for line, something from, a court order or from a motion. Those are situations that come up, immediately. Well, what about, parents that let's say you separated from the other party when before the child was born. Let's take it that extreme. And they're talking about, well, you know, my dad cheated on my mom, or like these other things that they kind of use to justify these decisions that they have no personal knowledge of. They couldn't have personal knowledge of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I know those are extreme examples to kind of highlight. It can happen more, it can certainly happen in the moment too, but we know that it can't be true in those situations. So it becomes clear to highlight.
It's you make a good point there. A lot of times it happens over time. It's and a lot of times I also, to be fair, it's not deliberate, right? It's the parent doesn't have any outlet, so the child becomes the outlet for them to vent to, and they share things they shouldn't be sharing, like for example emotion and specific stuff in it. It's funny you mentioned that because that's what I dealt with my mother. Oh, we're going back to court. Your father said this, blah blah blah, and you look back on it. One instance of that probably is not going to have an effect, but I heard it for years,
Mm-hmm.
and it does have an effect long term. And now different time than now. I think the courts back then they didn't recognize it all. We're talking the 60s and 70s. Yes, I'm that old. But now I think there's a little bit more awareness of it. And would I be fair in saying that judges their ears would perk up, if we will, if they start hearing a child recite something that might be in the motion or all that? And what would they kind of do then? Because that's an interesting point.
Well, I look at it most of the time, the court let's think about this traditionally, because more often than not in the history of family court and dealing with situations like this, you are probably getting a windfall if you are the alienating parent.
Hmm.
And I'll defend the judges a little bit on that too. It's like, how could they know? They know this kid doesn't want to have anything to do with the other parent, and that's it, pretty much. They don't really look any deeper than that. And you can hide behind best interest on that. You can understand that, look, this is what they want, and I have to consider their express desires if they're a certain age, and all these things that the court can kind of fall back on. But forever, that's the way it went. There is this other extreme. So what I had found kind of in dealing with situations like this in the past, before the last couple of years, was that it was really one extreme or the other. It was either, oh, yeah, I mean, maybe she shouldn't have been talking about this, but, it's fine. He wants to live there. We're going to send him there. Or it's like, let's do something just extreme, radical. We're going to flip because we're punishing them. They were so bad about this. Here's the text messages where they're telling the kid, your other parent's a piece of crap. You don't need to be seeing them, blah, 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 whatever it is, something that's very obvious. And there was not a whole lot of room in the middle. And there was no real way, no real thought process in what is actually best for this kid. How do they deal with, these issues? How do we fix them? Another common tool that the court would use a lot is kind of giving discretion to the kid, which is, in research and in talking to professionals on this, it's the worst thing that you
I
can
was
do.
just gonna say that's not
It
always the best thing. Yeah.
is absolutely the worst thing to do. Because even if you put little pieces of discretion, what you're telling that kid is, look, your plan worked. You got control of this situation. Now, if you don't want to go over there, you get to decide if you go over there or not. And maybe it should be less time. Maybe less time is a part of that solution, but taking discretion out of it is a really big piece of that puzzle. And it was a lot of really good judges that were doing this. It was judges that were trying to work and rebuild this relationship and trying to, kind of stair step it back up to where it should be. But in the end, what they were doing was empowering, you know, the the child and the alienator into doing this more because they were giving them the discretion. And then all of a sudden, hey, this discretionary visit, well, do you want to do that or do you want to go to Chuck E. Cheese today?
Right.
Or I, again, it's extreme examples, but that's the kind of things that you would see in that scenario. Or, well, let's schedule your baseball practices that day, or whatever it is.
Hmm.
There was just ways that you can manipulate that, or hang out, drop off for a visit and don't go anywhere, and just wait and see, or put that pressure on them. That I've kind of seen come up in a lot of different cases on that front.
Do you find, because one of the things, again, I refer back to New York a lot because that's where my cases were, and I observed hundreds of cases because I used to go in support of guys for their cases and kind of help them work through it. But one of the things that I notice New York tends to do is fall back on guardian ad litems. Some people call them child advocates. I think that's what North Carolina refers to them as. And again, they don't have any training. The one in my case, I always tell this joke. This might make you laugh, but I learned family law really well. I studied it, represented myself a lot. I had a really good attorney, and she would say, "No, you got this one. Go handle it." That type of thing. But there was a time, the guardian ad litem, I call them gals, just because I don't like talking that much. But anyway, she was spewing on something that my ex and my child were saying that are related to the alienation, and I started quoting chapter and verse, and the judge looked at the guardian and said, "He knows the law better than you do," which was like, this was pretty cool. But one of the things that I found was that they don't have the training either, but often the judges were relying on them in these situations. The judge suspected there was alienation going on. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know. I shouldn't say just he. So they're relying on this person who's supposed to be representing the child and only the child. but they're getting swayed. And again, to defend them, they're not getting the training that they should. Do you see that here in North Carolina? And do you view that maybe across the states itself, all the states? What's your viewpoint on that?
Well, it is going to depend a lot, and there's a lot of state-specific elements to that. I think by last count, I've been in about 15 counties or so in North Carolina. All of them do this a little bit differently. So
Mm-hmm.
you're going to get different responses. One of the things that happens a lot in the smaller counties is when you have a GAL appointed, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be just one of the local attorneys that are filling into that role. Which, when you talk about the knowledge element, yeah, maybe they have knowledge about, family law, about the court system, about what should happen, but they're busy. It's the same kind of people that are doing like court appointed lists, across these counties. So they either, number one, are not prepared at all, or number two, they're really not prepared, but they do a good job of pretending like they are. There's really just not enough time for them to have to delve into these issues. And then if you're in a case with a GAL, and it is fairly rare in the smaller counties too, so don't, this is not a regular thing. You get a family court district, which that's another kind of distinguishing factor across North Carolina, whereas some judges do all kinds of cases,
Mm-hmm.
and some are limited in certain counties to just family law, which you'll see very different responses there. But in those counties, you'll see a lot more GALs in that situation, and some more from, like, a private standpoint. And in DSS cases, we get GAL volunteers, like kind of what you're describing there is more closely related to that
Mm-hmm.
system. Um, but it is very much county dependent. And in my experience, you are paying a lot and probably rolling the dice on whether they're going to be on your side or not. And it's probably not because they're more informed or they're able to make a better decision. It's really just, you know, kind of flip a coin, and they may help you one way or another. But like you said, it's really easy for a judge to rely on that. They got a hard decision to make, and they don't know what to do. They don't know if it gets even more complicated when you factor in what the allegations are.
Right.
Because in some situations, and I know this is where it gets really, really controversial, but where you have allegations, maybe sexual abuse allegations or abuse allegations, and you're trying to determine one way or another, whether this is alienation or is it abuse. And in those scenarios, a judge is always going to want, they've got a GAL saying this is abuse. They're not going to go against that. I mean, and you have to understand that. Why would they? I mean, they're risking putting this child back in, an abusive situation.
Well, it's funny you say that because I've talked about this before. That family court judge that I talked to that was no longer on the bench, him and I had a very long conversation about this, and he goes, "Put yourself in this role. Do you want your name in the newspaper as the person who will let an abuser abuse a child? There's no way I'm going to do that. I'm always going to err on the side of caution." So I understand and respect that. It's not right. They should listen and
Agree.
yeah, but it is the reality, and they're human beings. Most people think family court judges are these evil, horrible. They're not. They're human beings. I actually got on a first name basis with the one in my case. I used to see him in town. "Hey, Courtney, how you doing?" It was like once we got out of the courtroom, it was a different scenario. But your point is very valid that it's a no-win situation for them.
But that's where education is the biggest factor.
Mm-hmm.
If they know more, they're able to make that decision maybe against, what a GAL says, or what, whatever the cautionary tale would be. The more informed they are, the more likely they're going to be to decide that on their own without, kind of erring on the side of caution.
Right. Well, and the other side of it too is, like we talked about, they have a time limit, right? They handle so many cases in many jurisdictions. They're just overwhelmed, so they can only give. They read the two motions. They go in the courtroom. Most of the time, my experience, if you were lucky, you got up to an hour. Some were a little bit longer. Most were shorter, but on average, that's where I tend to pin it. Again, this is New York, not North Carolina. Everything's different. But they're in an impossible situation. But when, especially abuse, they're going to always err on the side of caution. I think that kind of rolls over into alienation too, though, is they don't know, and they fall behind that nebulous concept of best interest of the child, which is not defined anywhere. I mean, not that I've ever seen. And unfortunately, that becomes a struggle for both parents at that point, and also for the attorneys, because your job is to represent your client to the best of your ability. And I mean, the question I want to ask is, have you ever been the attorney for the alienator that you know of? And how did you handle that? Because that's something I've actually never asked an attorney.
Well, yes. I mean, the simple answer is yes. And it is amazing how difficult this process is if you are the alienated parent, and how simple it can be if you are the alienator. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they have such a huge ability to resolve this case. And that's one of those things that, that's the TikTok versus, look, when I'm representing a client, like, you can say all the, the bad names or whatever, but I am representing their interests. And ultimately, in 99% of the situations, I have to represent their express interests,
Right.
so it really doesn't matter what I think about it, or I don't think about it. But because best interest of the child is the standard, and because of exactly what you've just described, there's so much that can go into that. I'm going to tell them what I think about it. It would be I wouldn't have always done that, but if I have that case today, I'm going to tell them how important having both parents involved in their child's life is, how important having this time is, and how, did you ever think like that, when your child says, I don't want to go today, that you are the one singular person that could influence them in the opposite way. You could influence them to go, to be open-minded about it, to have that experience. And that's something that really gets lost. That's one thing that I wish judges would do more of, is force more out of that alienating parent. And I don't want to get too deep in this, because there are plenty of situations like you described where
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's not an intentional thing. They're not trying. Sometimes they are, but they're not always trying to cut this other parent out. They may be dealing with their own grief. They're dealing with their own issues in response to whatever this trauma is that they're going through. Just like anybody else, and they're people, and they make mistakes, and they don't always handle it the best. But if judges, I think, would force more of that on them, like, no, you've got to be the one that's really doing this. You've got to be the one that's really pushing this. And I don't know how, but I think that's a concept and an idea that attorneys, everybody, could be more accountable in those situations. Obviously, given the ethical concerns too. So it gets more complicated. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm going to tell that client. And I think it does hurt their case in a lot of situations if they get caught doing these things, or it comes out. And if you ever want to have custody flipped, yeah, you may win a lot of the time, but it also makes it more likely that that's going to come back on you too, because eventually that is the response to alienation. You described it kind of
It
in your
happened
own
to me. That was
situation, right?
exactly my case. It, it,
Yeah.
it took 10 years, but that's what
And it
happened.
may, right.
Yeah.
But eventually that's the response. Eventually the court gets to what else do I do but flip it back? And I know there's plenty of people that go through this that don't have that experience. So I don't want to say that's always the way it goes. But it's not a lie for me to tell my client, you shouldn't do this, and here's why, because there are a lot of situations that it would, get turned back against them on those
How
things.
do they respond to you when they say? I'm just curious, because again, I've never been the alienator, and you are in a difficult position because your job is to represent that person. And yes, you're going to give them the advice you're giving them. Hey, this is not a great idea. But if they dig their heels in, you have a job to represent them. It's not like you can go, nope, I'm done. I'm going to walk away. Well, there may be instances you can, but for the most part, you're stuck, right? Um, how do they respond to you when you say, hold on a minute, let's think this through? Because there are the extremes. The majority of the time, I'm sure they're listening to you. But if you get someone that digs their heels in and goes, no, you're wrong. How do they respond to your advice? I guess.
sometimes I'm going to get fired.
Really?
You know,
Yeah, it's gonna
I
happen.
mean,
Yeah.
it's going to happen every once in a while, and most of the time, look, we got plenty of cases. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Unfortunately,
not
right?
maybe in a different time and a different, when I don't have as many calls, maybe I'd care more about something like that happening, but that's not where I am right now. But it's just one of those things where there's a way to approach that for sure. And I tend to think that's something that I do pretty well at, kind of explaining it to people or breaking it down in a way, that maybe it makes them reconsider some of the choices that they're making. But, are we going to be dealing with it a month later? Probably,
Hmm.
probably. I think most times it's going to take something more radical and more extreme to change that from them.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is such a broad spectrum that you see with this. So it's hard to like this is the case or that But again, I'm speaking from my own experience where my attorney she would sit down with me and try and explain that mindset that my ex was having because she represented people that were alienators and she was blunt as hell. I love her to death for it because I respected that she was blunt to me. Look, dude, you're wrong. Shut up, and I'm okay with that. A lot of people aren't, but it's just interesting to hear because some of them do, the alienators will. My ex dug her heels in, and unfortunately for the children, forget me, she had an attorney that was just looking to rack up billable hours. There unfortunately there's great attorneys, there's bad attorneys. Let's be honest. And that's what he would do. He would go, they would file. I said the other day to someone, if I farted wrong, they would file a motion. And it's come on. Even the judge at one point is like, what are we doing here? But it's just interesting to hear that perspective that you're bringing to it. I want to shift the conversation, if I could, a little bit, Frank, to talk about
Yeah.
if if a client comes to you as the alienated parent, how would you explain to them what their options or legal recourses are? Understanding that states are different, but they're also not so different.
Yeah, the first thing that I usually do is give a warning. Um, and again, it's not necessarily what anybody wants to hear in this scenario either. But the warning is that the response almost always is they know that the child has been influenced. They know they've been told things they weren't supposed to be told. So the response is typically, I'm going to try to fix it. I'm going to talk my way out of it. I'm going to explain, the same things about the other parent. I'm going to, kind of fight fire with fire, for lack of a better phrase. And that's one of the first warnings that I have. Ultimately, if we can prove alienation, one of the easiest ways to do it is when there's not those red flags against it. I've seen a ton of cases where my client is alienated, but because of their response, the judge is actually labeling them as the alienator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that happens a lot because they are the ones that are then trying to fix this problem by doing something similar. And so that's the warning. And I know it's like, okay, well, great. What do I do then? And it is such a complicated issue. There's legal recourse that's there. There are certainly ways that we can show, you want to you want to track text messages, you want to track things in particular that a child would say. And like I said, I think the court is getting better and better about child testimony and really deducing what is meant out of that child's testimony, especially when no parents are around.
Mm-hmm.
But that's don't fight it back. Kind of trying to take a step back and understanding like you want to vilify this other parent, but that's probably not the best route to getting you what you want out of this either. So I always think it's a great idea to talk to somebody. I don't mean pay somebody. Look, there's tons of stuff that you can spend money on in this arena. And, we could talk about this. I have some very good experts that I trust in cases like this, but they don't have jobs if it's not for this issue. So they are going to talk about that issue because it makes them more money. It's the reason that they're employed. And there's some that I would urge people to steer away from. But talk to somebody that's just neutral of it. It can just be a friend, whatever, somebody that could look at it from the outside, and kind of just let them let them level you out a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because you're going through this, you don't know how to handle it, and your kid may have just said, "Hey, I don't even want to see you, and I don't love you," and and it may have came out of nowhere, which is what happens with these sometimes. But the first step is really just taking a step back, and I would always urge court in these scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars on attorney's fees. It may cost that to handle this, but at the same time, it may not be required. Even just putting it in front of the court, um, is better than nothing. I just don't think you can roll over on it either, because it's not going to get better,
Mm-hmm.
when you're dealing with these, this response.
It's interesting because the first thing that I advise people, because people will ask me, I'm the one they'll come to, like I'm being, I think I'm being alienated, my lawyer, blah blah blah, and I will say to them, you got to take the emotion out of it, which is
Mm-hmm.
hard, if not impossible, if we're being honest. But you have to take, like you said, that step back, and just process it first of all. However that might be, it might be you can do it on
Right.
your own, or go to a trusted friend, family member, whomever. And yes, get help, whatever form that might be. It might be something as simple as your best friend, your buddy. It might be you need to talk to a health professional. Who knows, right? Everybody's different. There's no right or wrong,
Exactly.
but that's the first step. I agree with you, because fighting fire with fire, to use your term, is, in my opinion, as a layman, the biggest mistake you can make, because for the exact reasons you're talking, you're going to be then viewed as the person doing it.
Exactly.
So once you've gotten past that point, from the legal perspective, you would file a motion, I assume, at that point, of some sort. Everything's going to be dependent on the case, but can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the process of it? Maybe not specifics, but just in general.
Yeah, sure. And again, I'm only licensed in North Carolina, so it's specific to that. Obviously, the particulars are going to be a little bit different in every case, but you really want to do one of two things, or really one of three things. It's either going to be contempt, a motion for contempt, and maybe it could be. It is hard to prove contempt in some situations here, depending on how old the child is. You really don't want it to be dependent on what the other party did wrong, but that's a start, and maybe it's a combination. What we end up doing more often than not is a combination of the three. But it's either contempt, or it's a motion to enforce your current order, or it's a motion to modify whatever that order is, if there is something in that order that would allow for this to happen, or allow for there to be no visits, or or you want to change it. You want to take that kind of legal custody, or something about that control that's been exerted from the other party away. So if you're asking me what I would file if there is a custody order in place, I would file a motion that includes all three of those things:
Mm-hmm.
a motion to enforce, a motion for contempt, and a motion to modify.
Yeah, I mean, and again, to your point, every state's different, but it usually, I'm somewhat versed on this because I filed my own motions many times. But um, and here's a point that I would make, and I'm sure you'll agree with me on. You got to make sure that motion, all your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, because anything you do wrong in that motion, they'll toss it. I mean, I did it myself. That's
Yeah,
where getting a good attorney, a lot of guys and girls, but guys mostly, will try and represent themselves in this process. And not to toot my own horn, but I got pretty educated on it. But I wouldn't dare put the motion in until I ran it by an attorney, because you screw up, you could actually end up hurting your case far more.
yeah, that is a very true part of this. And look, money is a very real element in this, and I don't think, like, don't take money as the reason that you can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I can't afford an attorney, so I'm just going to let this happen. I'm not going to see my kid at all for a year, for 2 years, for whatever this timeline is. That is way worse. The damage of that is way worse than you filing it on your own in every situation, I would say. But if you if it's a question of whether you can afford it or not, I would decide that question before you filed it on your own, because there are things, it is oftentimes more expensive. There's more we have to undo if we're
Mm-hmm.
kind of fixing, the mistakes that you've made, or if you've already been to court and it's been dismissed, like you described there. So come to an attorney first, and then, go from there. I don't want to, not I have some resources that, we'll talk more later about my TikTok. I do a Facebook forum too, that, I kind of go through some of this on like, hey, if I was going to do this myself, what would I do?
Mm-hmm.
And typically, North Carolina, we have a lot of like standard forms that you can use. Those are great resources for doing it. The problem is they give you like this much space, very little amount of space to write in, hey, what are the reasons to modify? And every court is going to kick it out if you only use that much space. And that's the standard form that we're giving people. So take that and then, write C exhibit, and then you type out as many pages of facts as you want to.
I'm laughing right now, Frank, because I made that exact mistake. New York had the same form. Well, probably not the same form, but similar form. First time I ever did it, I only got 3 lines. I got to put everything in. Judge tossed it, rightfully so, to defend the judge here. And that's when I learned, see page, blah, 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 of exhibit, blah, blah, blah. But that's a great point you just made there. That something as simple as that could cost you a lot more money in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you're getting the motion filed. What happens then next? Because I'm trying to help people to understand the process that you're going to have to deal with, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with that.
Yeah, and let me rewind too. This all assumes that you have a current custody order. And if you don't, then it's a completely different process too, which I know is a little bit of added complication. But you're filing a new lawsuit if you don't have a court order currently. And that summons, cover sheet, all those things. But when you file your motion, again, it's county specific. So there are certain code words or code things that you have to do in certain counties to play. And a lot of clerks' offices are really good about helping with what those things are. There are places where you can find that information. nccourts.org has a list of local rules, but it's like, a judge wrote it or an attorney wrote it, and it is very, it is legal language. It is attorney driven, and the attorneys know what that stuff means, and you may not. So that's why I think finding those resources can be helpful there too. But ultimately, what you're going to want to do is file your motion. You're going to have the timestamp on it, at the courthouse, and then you want to serve it. And, the easiest way for you find this on your own is to use sheriff service in that scenario. You pay a little bit extra there when you file it, and the sheriff will take those documents out and serve it. It's not the best way to serve. In fact, it's probably the worst, but it is the simplest for you to kind of just check the box. I've served them, and then, rely on the sheriff from there. Now, once you get to court after that, and they may preset whatever that date is, or you may have to file it on your own. Mm-hmm. So after that point, you've got to do what's called a notice of hearing. If it's not on the calendar, if it is, then obviously you show up, but you're still going to have service before you can move forward. And, there's a lot of other little steps that are in there. Mediation is typically going to be required on any motion to modify in most counties, and it depends a little bit on the scenarios there. But for the most part, you can about bank on having a mediation in between, which would be a reason to continue it out or, kind of delay it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I often hear from people is that this process can take a long time. And, to give New York somewhat credit for my cases, most of the time, if a motion was filed, we were in the courtroom if it got that far, because a lot of times it didn't. But if we did, it was, 4 to 6 weeks was probably the average. I've heard months. Every jurisdiction is different. Every state's different. Every county's different. But in your opinion, what do you think it would be like an average time frame for all this process to go through?
Well, any cases dealing with alienation, you can probably expect a longer timeline. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is judges don't like throwing permanent orders on alienation cases because they're so time specific. What's happening right now may not be what's happening in a few months. So you can almost always expect to have a little bit of time, even once you get, kind of into what I'd call like the trial stage. And a lot of us in Mecklenburg County, you're probably looking at years, over a year on at minimum to have something like this heard. In the smaller counties, it could be as little as a month. Mm-hmm. It really just depends on what county you are, and it's so county specific. Even in the counties that I practice in, in Asheville, they're going to give you a date the second you file it for court. It may not be, it's not going to be soon. It may be a couple months, but it's not going to be like our Charlotte sort of timeline. In McDowell County, where I kind of started and did the bulk of my practice, I could file it tomorrow and I could notice it on for 2 weeks from now, and would be a trial on that day.
Right.
It may not be, but it could be if we get service quickly and they're not pushing it out. Usually you're going to get one continuance if a party wants it, and so maybe it's more like a 2 to 4 month kind of deal on the front end before you get heard the first time. And obviously, there's tons of reasons that cases get kicked out every day. One attorney's not available, or whatever the kind of the games that get played sometimes.
Right. And that the reason I asked that question is because I want people to understand you're going through an emotional upheaval. You're not seeing your kid, for example, for weeks. But the reality is this is going to take a while, even if you get a quick court date, like you said, there's continuances, you got potentially discovery, all this stuff can delay it, delay it. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is you need to make sure you have support, whatever that might be, because it could be a year. It could be, I've heard 2 and 3 years in some instances, and you're not seeing your kid. And unfortunately, the damage is being done that whole time to your relationship or lack thereof with the kid. But you at least can have an understanding of it. And that's one of my goals with this, is to make sure that people have understanding, because one of the things I see all the time is, I'm being alienated. Why aren't the courts doing anything? Well, there's a process involved, and you may not like the process. You might want it to be different, but there's also the reality of it, and you need to accept that. And that's where I think, again, one of the things that I always tell guys, because I mostly talk to guys, and I would say the same to women, if you're dealing with, you think it's an alienation case, you need to get an attorney. There are certain things I would handle on my own and feel very comfortable with. Child support, I had no problem handling myself, and my attorney knew I would. Alienation, right. You have to have an attorney, is my opinion. Yes, you can go pro se, represent yourself and all that. There is so much involved. And you mentioned something earlier, which I think is a key point. The attorneys know how to play the game. You didn't quite phrase it that way, but I will. And know what's going to ping the judge, ping the clerks and all that to get their attention. So, I mean, I really appreciate you bringing those points up, because you are literally talking about your children's life, and if you can get a good quality attorney that can support you the way they're supposed to from the legal perspective. And by the way, they're not your therapist. If I may throw that, you probably, I see you starting to smile there. Don't call your attorney to be your therapist. You're paying them hundreds of dollars to go, yep, you're right. How does that make you feel? No, go to a shrink for that. But I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in on that. Sorry.
Well, no, it's a great point. And I agree with you. But I just don't want to come off that way. If I say you need an attorney, then it's because, of course, you're going to say that. You're an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
You need to hire this person. But are my results in an alienation case going to be better than yours going along? 99 times out of 100, yes, they are. And you can look at this like, a lot of clients have a difficult time understanding this part, which is, it is the hardest situation that they dealt with. It's their kid. It's their whole life. They think about it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They want me to think about it that way too. They want me to, to be living and dying on every moment like they do. But the thing is, in a lot of situations, if that was really what was best for the case, I would do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, you're hiring this person, you're paying them the money. You have to have some faith in them to know how to navigate this too. And that is a tough pill to swallow. And again, I'm not saying don't push back, because attorneys will make mistakes, and there are crappy attorneys out there for sure. And if you don't think they're doing right, tell them. But at the same time, there may be a reason that they're telling you this. And, I haven't seen my kids and I want to be heard today. I use this all the time in cases, which is if we have this heard today and the judge decides something today, that is written in stone. We can, it doesn't mean it can't change, but they are going to see that forever. And if we're not ready to do this today, or we're not ready for whatever reason because of something else or outside factor, and one of the biggest things that I can do as an attorney is prepare you for what the results are going to look like, what range of results there might be. And if that doesn't look like it's going the right direction, you need to trust me when I say that. And I know that's easier said than done. But when I say today's not the day, it's not because I don't care about you seeing your kid. It's because today's not the
Right.
damn day. Sorry
Right.
for saying
No,
it. That way.
feel free, because I think this is an important thing for people to hear, guys, girls, whatever, that that attorney has your best interest in mind. Their job is to represent you and to tell you the truth. That's my viewpoint, right? It's not fun to hear. I've been on the receiving end of an attorney saying, "Dude, it's not the right day," right? Or
Mm-hmm.
you need to understand that what you want is not going to happen right now. And it's a bitter, bitter pill to swallow, because you want to see your kid. You love your kid. You want to be there for them. You want to be their dad, their mom, whatever. So I understand all that, but I love what you're saying, because it's so important to make people realize that you've got to trust that attorney. You hired them for a reason. And you're right. There are some bad attorneys out there. There's also some very, very good ones. And I've done talks before on how to find good attorneys and all that. I don't want to get into that now, but if you find an attorney and you can put your trust in them, my personal opinion is your chances of success, whatever they may be, skyrocket. And I think you basically that's what you're saying also.
Yeah. And there are times even where you may be pushing back on your attorney or saying things to me. I hear this from clients and I'm like, you are absolutely right. It should be today. It should be today. And, the system or the court or whatever, for whatever reason, they got it wrong and you should be winning today.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't. But the doesn't change the facts. Like you're still living in what is happening. This is the reality of the court that we are dealing with today. And you're paying me to give you advice on this. So, I'm trying to help you there. And there are times and days and way few people spend the time, doing the right lobbying and pushing at the right times. And they want to complain about it at court. And that's fine. You have a right to do that. And certainly there are times when they get it wrong, but you're just asking the wrong questions at that time. If you're saying it shouldn't be this way, when once you get to court, deal with what is. And that's what your attorney at least should be trying to do for you, is answering the question of what is, not,
Mm-hmm.
not what should be. And I get it. I mean, I get it. Trust me, I get it. And there are plenty of situations where the court gets it wrong on that.
And having been on that receiving end, like you're talking about, the attorneys do know. Like I remember my attorney, her name was Karen. There was one time we came out of court. She goes, "I can't believe that just happened." Like she was stunned, and I could see it. And I was like, "How did that happen myself?" But it does affect you as an attorney. It's just, but you have a job to do also, right?
Mhm.
And I'm trying to defend attorneys here, which trust me is not an easy thing for me to do, my friend. But you're not doing your job the right way either if you sugarcoat it, right? It's like, this sucks. Yes, here's what we can do, right? Or here's what we can't do. Because in a lot of instances, you have to deliver some bad news. Like, all right, yeah, we can file an appeal on whatever situation. Your odds
Right.
of winning it are slim and none, and Slim left town a long time ago. Because family court judges, in my experience and what I've seen, and having talked with tons of attorneys and judges, the odds of it getting overturned are like ridiculously low, and the only way it's going to get overturned is on a procedural. Not They're never going to
Right.
question the judge's judgment, so to speak. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, have been a handful of times where I have noticed issues, and there are a couple of times that we've appealed, on those. But for the most part, in family court, it is a little bit different again when we're dealing with, maybe the same issues, but in a protective services case.
Hmm.
There's a lot more ability to appeal kind of in those scenarios, or a termination of parental rights case. But yeah, in family court itself, it's going to be rare. They have a wide range of discretion there, but you know, there are definitely those days where I'm like, I don't know what they were thinking there, and even to take that a little bit further, like I use this on my TikTok channel sometimes where it's, I used to play a lot of poker, and, poker, you're going on a range, you have a range of potential outcomes that could happen with the cards that you have and the cards that are on the table, you know, based on your own actions. And even let's throw your attorney in there. Let's say your attorney could do everything right, and you are sitting there holding a pair of aces, and then that river card comes and it's a king, and the other side just made three kings or whatever. I don't want to take it too far on the analogy, but you can't focus too much on the results sometimes. I know the result is the only thing you care about, but it's about positioning.
Hmm.
You want to put yourself in the absolute best position for the best possible outcome. And then the rest of it's out of your control at that point. The judge may have just woke up on the wrong side of the bed.
I was
The
just,
judge may,
I was just about to say that the judge could be having a bad day and just
yeah.
decided you're the one I'm going to take it out on. It does happen. It shouldn't happen. We can all acknowledge that, but it does happen. You know. Let me shift a little bit further here. So one of the things that I want to kind of, as again, my goal is to educate people, but if someone suspects this is the case, or let's say they've even come to you at this point and you've filed a motion or whatever, how do they help you strengthen the case? What should they do? What we've talked a little bit earlier about what you shouldn't do, which is fight fire with fire, but like what would you advise someone who's dealing with this to do to help their attorney present the best possible case for you, documentation wise? Like one I'll throw out is don't delete anything, but I'll
Yeah.
let you take it from there. Any advice?
Well, let's take it a step further. Don't delete anything, but assume that a judge is reading everything that you send too. That's a really good place to start. The other thing that I like for people to do is just go get like a cheap calendar, you put it up on the wall, just jot some notes down. It'll help you kind of remember back to when certain things happen. And those are the kind of things that, like, it's not mom specific, but moms are very good at keeping those details a lot more often than dads are,
Yeah, that's
at least
true.
in my experience.
You're true.
And
You're
it's like
right.
you want to play that game with them, and if you're able to do that and you're able to testify that, hey, this is the day this happened, because you it happens a lot of times where you get up and testify and it's like, well, this has happened like every week. It's like, well, tell me when. I it's always happened, but
Mm-hmm.
if you give those specifics and you're labeling them in the moment, there's a lot of credibility that is added by that. And then you can show the text messages that go with it, and they may not be explicitly saying you're a piece of crap and you're never seeing your kid again, but taken in context with what you say that they didn't bring the kid that day, it can start adding up. So, that's a good way. I always tell people don't worry so much about I don't care what kind of time it is. Like, it is easy for people to kind of throw the walls up when their child doesn't want to be around them or is not, not kind of engaged in it. This may be held against you too, but do something fun. Kind of take them. Put the phone down for that visit. I know that's something that I see a ton, and this is not mom and dad specific. There are moms that are alienated too, but mom or dad, you put the phone down, engage. If you need to do a little bit of your own self help, like you know, why would it be a bad thing to take a parenting course, for instance? Like, who would not have some benefit from that? What people don't want is they don't want to be told that they have to do it, or anyway, don't let it get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Show that you made some efforts to fix some of the issues that are going on. If there are underlying issues that have led to whatever is happening or whatever's going on with the kid, work to address those too. But the calendar is a really great one. Keeping track of all those things. I'm not big on recordings. I know there's a time and place for them, and there are some times where they're effective. But I just think when you are recording and you know that you're recording, you act differently, and when somebody else knows they're being recorded, they act differently. It just is the way that it ends up playing out, and it often ends up making you look worse.
If I can interrupt you for just a second on that, also recordings depending on the state, right? Some states
Yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
admissible and some are
Definitely depending
not.
on the state. In North Carolina, for
Go
the
ahead.
most part, you can, but just agreed there. I don't like them anyway. Let's just put
Right,
it that way.
right. One piece of advice that I've always given people is, if rather than a recording, if you have someone that you trust, like I would bring someone with me. When I knew she was going to deny me visitation, I would have
Hmm.
someone with me, a credible witness that could then go. And I think my personal opinion, and my attorney vouch for that, is that it gives more credibility to it rather than a recording, because like you said, recordings, they can also be manipulated, I'm sorry to say, and unless you want to
Yeah,
pay a lot of money to make sure that it wasn't. That's a good point. The other thing too, is I kept a diary, and I this is something I advise the guys: date, time, no emotion.
yeah.
And I would hand it to the, I mean, I handed, I'm not joking that. And it was funny, the point you made is there was one time I had to go on the stand, and I said, can I have my journal? I called it a diary. And they objected to it. Well, why does he need that? And the judge eventually let me have it. And the question came up, and I don't get into the specifics, but I was like, here, hold on. Here's the date. Here's the time. Here's what I said. Here's what she said. Here's what happened. That raised my credibility in the judge's eyes, like that. I could tell. So those are great points. What else would you suggest?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up on the diary too. And I think if you can keep a diary, do it that way. But don't make conclusions with it. Let me just add on to that part, because a lot of times what people will think is alienated me on
Yeah, that's not going to work.
Friday, May 1st. No, no. What happened? What happened? And stick to the facts, like without the emotion, as you said. I think that's fantastic advice. And those are the things that, I wouldn't even be nervous about a judge reading if it just had the facts, but when you start putting your opinion of what happened in there, and I'm not saying it's not important, you can testify to those things, but that really shouldn't be what you're recording. You could obviously always go back and talk about that part. Um, After this, I think my next steps after those simpler ones, um, would be, I think it's going to depend on what your financial resources are like from there. If you don't have a lot, being if they're school age, be involved at school. If they're going to the doctor, call. I tell, this is kind of a blanket thing here. It's not specific to alienation, but call, make sure the doctor's office knows who you are,
Mm-hmm.
knows that you're on the paperwork. If at the school, make sure they know who you are, talk to the teachers. If they don't have record of that, or you're not on the paperwork, take your custody order up there, take your birth certificate up there. Those are the kind of things that in a lot of states, North Carolina, I know, and it doesn't mean that you're going to get the right answer, but they should be allowing those things just by virtue of you having a legal status as a parent. Um, so, but other than that, I think we really start getting into that expert range pretty quickly when it comes to alienation.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't afford it, it could be a real help to involve. And then I think it's going to talk to an attorney pretty quickly after that too.
Can you, I mean, I obviously can't put specifics on it, but can you give a range of like what an expert costs? Because I know, but I think it would be interesting for others to hear. It's not a couple $100s.
No, you're probably looking at, this is going to depend a lot where you are too.
Yeah.
But you're not going to find, that expert in, Marion or some of our smaller towns. You're going to have to go to the cities to get them. You're probably looking at about, I started to say, like in my mind, the number that jumps out to me right off is about
That's
$10,000.
the number I was going to
Um,
use because that's
I'm
universal
not going to
almost.
say that it's not less. There are times that it's less. There are
Right.
definitely times that it's less. There are definitely times that it's more. But and they're going to, you don't always get what you pay for in those scenarios. Sometimes you do.
Yeah.
I think it's really about how much vetting you do there and really how comfortable you are with the people that you choose. The court has a lot of power to kind of force those things, but the issue with that is they are forcing that price tag on you when you really don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, you want to try and maintain control of it rather than let them control it. And the number I was going to throw out is $10,000 to $20,000 because that's
That's
that.
probably a good
Yeah,
estimate. Yeah, I think I've had a couple recently that were less though.
yeah.
So
It really is
looking
going
at
to depend on the situation, the case, the expert. There are, just to give perspective that has nothing to do with family law, but I know an expert on PCBs, pollution.
mhm.
He's 10 grand an hour, and you got to pay for his travel, and he's not traveling coach. Trust me, my friends. Okay, and all. I mean, you're talking now. Obviously, different than family, but 10,000 an hour, and he's in the courtroom sometimes 6, 7, 8 hours. You know, but
Yeah.
he's also the world's foremost expert on it. So you're getting what you pay for, right?
Yeah, what's this topic again? PCB?
PCB. Oh yeah, I know. Actually, I don't know if he's doing it anymore. But anyway, um, as we're kind of wrapping things down, I want to kind of go where you want to go with this. Is what other advice would you have for someone? To basically want you to share your expertise on this matter at this point. Anything we didn't talk about, any advice you would give to, and let me be clear, this applies to both mothers and fathers. You've said that a few times. I think it happens more to fathers, to be fair, because that's the way
Yeah,
it
I agree.
works. But it does happen to mothers, and I don't want this to be, we hate mothers and we love fathers. No, that's not. It's parents in this case. So I just kind of turn it over to you at this point and let you kind of share.
Yeah, I know I have talked about that, and I don't want to. Again, it's not. I think it does happen more often to fathers than it does to mothers. I don't know the exact numbers on it, but I definitely think it's a higher percentage. But on the flip side, some of the worst cases I've actually seen have been towards mothers. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's two sides to that. Don't be in either one. I mean, I guess is
Amen.
the start. But when you are, um, I just know that there are a lot of people that are going through this. I mean, there are a lot of people every day that are dealing with this situation. You're not alone, and I think the courts are getting better. I don't want to defend them too much, but they are getting better. They are figuring out other ways to handle these situations. They are getting more educated on it, and there is more education that is out there every day. And I know that because I made a stupid TikTok video a year ago, and it's still getting views. And every once in a while, I think I'll make another one on it, and I get emails with questions about parental alienation and doing um, continuing education things on it and stuff like that. So there is there is a knowledge base that's growing out there, but the biggest thing I would tell you is, and I know this is way easier said than done, but there are people going through it, and there are times where this has changed. There are absolutely cases where people are alienated, and that relationship is resolved or fixed or better than the other parents, by the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have certainly seen that where people have been alienated, and then all of a sudden, it's the other parent that the child doesn't want to see, for whatever reason. So don't give up. It's easier said than done on that, I know, but it is a very real thing. And, we're growing. We're growing in this. And I know this, like we talked about this a little bit, I think. There is this corporate world of family court that is out there, and this idea that's out there. I've been lucky enough to be naive to it in some ways because of the counties that I've been in, where it's not, it never felt like a machine, that I was in. There was problems, obviously. There were plenty of issues, but it just never felt like this was this big greed, kind of machine that was driven. So there are places and there are people out there that are dealing with these issues on a very real level. And the cynical view of it, I understand it, but it's not helping you get through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of opening your mind to this possibility of what ways can I practically deal with this? And then once you're done dealing with it, then lobby like hell to change it. I think that's really where I would push most of the dads. And that's what I do push with the dads that I represent in these situations And we get a lot of good results on it, but it's not easy. And there's going to be, there's going to be time involved, and there's going to be a lot to it. But at the end, I don't know of many that don't think it's worth it when they get through it out the other side.
It's one really important point that you made in there is, and I'm saying this to the alienators, is be careful what you wish for, because
Mhm.
I'm a living example. I despise my mother with every fight, and she's passed. I despise her. I did not talk to her for the last 20 years of her life because of what she did. Because once I started finding out the truth, I became so resentful for what she took away from me that I basically banished her from my life. So you kind of hinted that it can turn around, and if nothing else, maybe that may give someone a little bit of pause before they start doing it. You know, I've studied a little bit about why people do it, and again, the gamut is so wide, and a lot of times
Right.
they don't know they're doing it.
Mhm.
We have to mention that. But there are people that deliberately, knowingly are out to do it. And, take a moment yourself to step back and realize the one you're really hurting is your child. And your child's not going to be happy once they find out, if they find out, I should say, too. So I do want to ask you another question real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything, like we've talked about it from the judicial standpoint, do you think there's anything legislatively that could be done? It's an
Oh,
interesting
gosh.
question.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I know I pushed for that, and I don't want to now say no. But the truth is, legislator goofs this up more than they get it right.
yeah.
Um,
You and I are in
I
agreement, by the way, on that.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe. I think I think pushing information is good.
hmm
I think pushing knowledge, awareness to the topic, information on the topic, I think those are fantastic things. And the more our judges know about this, the better. But legislatively, maybe, maybe there could be some way, and I'd be interested to know. I'm not aware of a state that has done it from that standpoint, but I'd be curious to know how it works out if they do. I just think it's still going to be wide discretion to the trial court.
Yeah.
I don't know how to avoid that.
Yeah, I don't know of any states either. I know that there's people that have pushed bills trying to
Yeah,
get at least parental alienation recognized as a legal, because in some states there's nothing codified. Maybe North Carolina's that way.
it is. Well,
Yeah,
it is.
there's
Yeah,
nothing in the law itself specific to it. Is that correct?
yeah, that's correct. I mean, and I like that's one of those things that goes back to that. That's your Google search right there. Um, and do a little bit of that backstory research. It's worth a little bit of time. I'm not going to touch on it too much, but kind of what got us to here. And there is some complications about kind of the origins of parental alienation. And I guess one of the things with me is I don't care what the heck you call it. I really
Right.
don't care what the court calls it either. As long as they recognize that a parent can influence a child against another parent. It's just, and it is so obvious though. I mean, we know these things. If you are sitting there with your 3 or 4 year old and you fake like you're crying, over in the corner, they're going to come over to you and try to make it better. If you say like to do that between one parent or another, you can manipulate those children in those situations. Like we know that is true. We know that you can do that. There's no expert that says you can't do that. And it's just this grander scale that there becomes some disagreement over. And I do want to make this point real quick because so if you do that research into the kind of the origins, it is very much centered around these sexual abuse allegations and kind of in response to sexual abuse allegations. I have never seen it in a single case where a child is alleging sexual abuse that a court has found that to be alienation or that I've thought it was alienation, honestly.
Hmm.
So, not that I think it's true all the time, but just that that's where it happens that way. So, when I make that distinguishing part, I just have like that is so removed from what the problems that most people are dealing with. Some will deal with it, but there's this, you know, I'm not going to say majority, but there is this wide range of parents who are dealing with alienation in one way or another. And there is like a very, very, very small portion that are dealing with any of these other issues that kind of trip up, this conversation about, what alienation is or isn't. And that's where, to me, it's like, who cares what you call it? That's where I get
Right.
back to that part. Whatever you want to call it. If we need a different name, let's come up with a different name. But let's not argue about whether it's real or not when we all know it's real.
Yeah, it's interesting though. There's a lot of people that deny it exists, and speaking about it from a legislative perspective, the other side of it too is be careful what you wish for, because when legislatures get involved in things, they tend
Yeah.
to screw it up more than they tend to fix it. I'm sorry, I will say it, and I'm probably headed to Raleigh in the next couple of weeks, so who knows what I'll find. Because one of the things that I'm starting to do is get involved with the North Carolina side of things like shared parenting and that kind of thing, because I think these things are important. But the other side of it too is realizing that legislatively may not be the best approach. I'd be curious, just like, is there any like reforms you'd like to see to help with this? Maybe that the courts themselves could implement, or maybe the bar, or for that matter, the legislator. Anyone? Is there any? What could you suggest to maybe help the process or make it better? I guess.
Yeah. Training our judges is the biggest part. I think I don't, and the bar too. I mean, the bar needs to be more aware of these issues in some situations too. Uh, we have judges conferences, they do training, they go through, certain parts of that. Like I said, the bench book is another resource that they use, and I don't have the most updated version. So, there may be a judge saying, oh, well, there's 100 times now. Maybe it is. But improving on those things, improving on those knowledge points. Um, I will touch on one thing, I think, from a legislative standpoint. This is a little bit of a different topic, but establishing paternity generally has to be an easier establishing your rights in a custody action or prior to filing a custody action has to be easier. But that's one thing that came to mind there a little bit when you were talking on that part. But when it comes to alienation generally, I don't know other than training at this point. I would be interested to know what kind of other things are out there, but I think it starts with education. And then from there, maybe there's other avenues that we move in.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm trying to make too. Is that there is no one answer out there. I think it's a combination of things. The training is a big one because my experience, having talked with lawyers, judges, and so forth, is the more they get educated on it, the more they're able to realize it may or may not be happening. Because there's a lot of times it's alleged when it's not happening. Let's be honest
Right.
about that too. Um, and giving them, for lack of a better term, the ammunition they need to be able to make a quality judgment. I hate defending I hate defending family court judges, but I do it all the time because when you actually sit down and talk with them, they're human beings, and for the most part, there are exceptions, as always, but the most part, they have the good of all the parties, not just the child, but both parents in their heart. I really believe that. And people need to see that. And the same with lawyers, by the way. I make fun of lawyers. I pick on y'all all the time. Um, you know, I forgetting the ambulance chasers. But in general, I think the majority of lawyers are doing the very best they can, and they do have everyone's interest at heart. They are representing their client. That's their job. That's their focus. But you also want the other party to come out of it healthy, if you like. Or maybe that's a bad term to use, but you're not trying to just drive them into the ground like so many people think.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, custody allows me to do that. It's by best interest being the standard. And look, I know there's a lot of negative with best interest, but in my mind, it kind of clears my conscience on those parts where, driving them into the ground is not best interest of the child either. So
Right.
your client's interests are almost never served by that. There could be some scenarios where that is the
You
case,
can always
but
find exceptions, right?
yeah,
And that's the problem. People dwell on those when the reality is 95 probably percent of cases. I'm throwing a number out, are not that. And you know, when you guys do your job right, not that everybody wins, but you come out of it a little bit less scarred, if you will. I want to give kudos to you as an attorney, and to all attorneys, because I think there's so. I'm sure you see it on your TikToks. I see it on my Instagrams, TikToks, YouTubes. That just out and out hatred towards attorneys and towards judges, and I'm trying to get people to see that that's not how they're thinking. Are there exceptions? 100%, I'll agree with, but as you're showing, and I think really quite eloquently, you're showing that you do have everyone's best interest. Yes, your clients first, but everyone's best interest. And that's what I love about your TikToks is that, and the reason I wanted you to have you on is that you're trying to educate people, because that, to me, like we were talking about solutions, that's the best solution, is not just educating the judges, as you mentioned, but educating the public that here's what divorce really is. Because we all have this misconception. You know, it's you're going to walk in, the judge is going to do this. No, it doesn't normally work that way. And I think one of the things that I wanted to make point of is that people should follow you on TikTok, whether you're going through a divorce or not, whether you're happily married or not, because I think there's a lot of information that you give out that can really help people. So, Frank, that all said, because it sounds like I'm plugging you shamelessly, and I am, how can they follow you on TikTok?
yeah, they can follow me at King Law CLT on TikTok, and I've got my link tree in there that that will send you out to a lot of other resources like our website and my completely free Facebook forum that you can get in, and you can ask any question in there. I kind of it's not, it wouldn't be specific advice, but anonymously you could give, whatever question you have, and I will do a video in response to it. I've done that for the last several months now, and check them out. Take a look at it again. That's King Law CLT, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I try to respond to my messages there. Sometimes that's easier than others, but don't hesitate to reach out on that front either.
And again, I highly encourage people to follow him. And yeah, I can relate to. I get hundreds of messages a day, and much like me, I'm sure you try and reply to them all, but you can't always. But just give it some time. Frank, anything else you want to add before we close things down?
No, I think we've covered a wide range for sure. I will just say again, if you saw these judges off the bench, you would not, I think there's this tendency to think it's like this kind of super elitist kind of club. That
Yeah,
is
that's a
not
good
at
point. Yeah,
all what most of these
no,
judges
they're
are.
not.
Yeah.
my
Um,
my particular judge, like I said, I used to run into him in town. Like I was on a first name basis with him. He's a funny guy. Yeah, but there were times I hated his guts. Don't get me wrong,
yeah.
but it was the situation, not him. That's a great point you're making there.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that even to defend them because I disagree with them. I guarantee you, I will disagree with our judges more than you will in your one case. I mean, it's going to happen every day almost with me that there's something that I'm going to disagree with the judge over. But at the same time, it is never to the point of where I think it's some sort of personal decision against anybody. Even if they are making a more personal judgment on you, they're just getting it wrong or they don't really know, and they're trying to they're trying to encapsulate 15 years or whatever of your child's life into 2 hours, so it's not going to be perfect. And I'm not saying that to defend them or say that they shouldn't get better because they absolutely should. And I get behind that. But, just understand that part. And hopefully there was at least something useful out of this. And I'm still learning on parental alienation too. There may be, like I said, there may be a book to come one day, but for now, I'm gonna keep making a few videos on it, and I'd encourage you to check them out and let me know what your thoughts are different from what I might be saying too. Because I promise I will talk to anybody about these issues. I will talk about things that you disagree with me over, and that may be a lawyer part of me, but look, we may argue about it today, and tomorrow I may argue your side. That's just the way that I'm going to learn. So I think that's something that we can all appreciate in terms of dealing with issues like this, even though they're obviously more real to you than they are necessarily to me, even though I'm dealing with them on the cases.
I'm going to say amen, brother, to that, because conversation is how things get better. Not, not to go political here, but right now we're in a world where it's everybody's black and white. Whatever their side is black, their other side's white. There shall be
Mm-hmm.
no gray, and that's where conversations. If we can get more of that going and understand each other better, especially when it comes to things like family law, and I would say that view your ex as a human being, and they are the parent of your child, part of it. So Frank, I want to say thank you so much for coming on, and if you write that book, I'm going to have you back on. Actually, I'm probably going to have you back on down the road again anyway, because I thoroughly enjoyed this, and actually I've learned myself a lot, and I appreciate your expertise and willingness to share it, and I encourage people to go follow you on TikTok. I will put links down below in the show notes so that you can just pop on over and go follow them on TikTok. Frank, final word from you.
No, check it out, and hopefully you're not going through this. But if you are and you need some more help, don't hesitate to check out the TikTok page or reach out to us directly, and we'd be happy to help you through that.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to go ahead and close the show down. So, hey, do me a favor, will you? We're trying to help educate people, as you saw with this podcast. I have some terrific guests, Frank being one of them, and I want to bring even more on, and I will be bringing even more on. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell if you're following me on YouTube, because that way when a new podcast goes up, which one does every Sunday at 11, you'll get notified on that. If you're following me on Spotify, same type of situation. Like and share this. There's a lot of information Frank gave in this that can really help people that might be thinking they're dealing with an alienator, or might be an alienator and not realize it, because as we said, it's sometimes you don't realize you're doing it, and also get a better understanding of how the process works. So like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. On that note, I'm going to say have an awesome day, and we'll see you next time on Men Need to Be Heard.